Well,
Okay.
thank you very much for having me.
Yes, take it away, JD. I'll mute myself.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me. I will say that my Dutch colleague definitely has better English than I do, so I do appreciate him opening. I will note, this isn't your usual scripted talk. I normally work through some of this material in a seminar-style discussion, so we'll keep it a little more conversational, befitting the nature of CrisisCon. Very quick mandatory caveat, obligatory disclaimers. These are my own opinions. They do not represent any element of the US government. And of course, all mistakes, errors are my own. Everything here will be entirely unclassified. Today, we're actually here to talk about a very difficult set of concepts. We've built a new cyber intelligence discipline, new meaning about 20 years old at this point, but we're running around building entire groups of practitioners, groups of folks that do the work, and as well as the consumer base that relies upon that work. And we're building it, frankly, in ways that are radically different than we've previously thought of intelligence in other contexts. There's a bit of history there, there's a bit of evolution of this space in the national context and the strategic context in other environments. But at the end of the day, we're finding that there is this thing we are doing now collectively is different than our predecessors. And in part, we face some challenges because we're not having the kinds of conversations about what those differences are, what those differences mean. And it's creating some clashes in expectations, particularly from those that have exposure to the national community and those that don't. And it's creating some disputes in terms of fundamental work practice, fundamental best practice, and some of the ways we go about tackling these hard problems, down to even some disputes or debates over the very purpose of what we're here to do when we talk about doing intelligence. I talk often about this idea of the non-traditional community of practice that is beyond the wheel. So the traditional way we've represented the intelligence community in the United States is a wheel of 19 agencies, now maybe 30. I mean, pick your poison how you want to draw that wheel. But at the end of the day, we have this view of who the intelligence community was and everyone else being outsiders. Well, we now have incredibly broader communities of practice that do things that are indistinguishable from intelligence work in any other classified national security context, working with their own sources and methods, working with their own material, and deserve to be treated with the degree of respect that you accord the rest of that community. But we need to not be talking past each other. So some of what we're here today is call out some of those disputes, call out some of the sources of those disputes, and bring that context into a different conversation. Now, quite some time ago, Sherman Kent, the gentleman who's widely considered the father of intelligence analysis as a professional activity here in the United States. Again, we can go back earlier centuries globally in varying degrees of professionalism back to the early modern period and varying degrees of engagement with government in different contexts for thousands of years before this. But at the end of the day, Sherman Kent began systemizing some of the ways in which we talk about this and really called for a literature of intelligence. He envisioned an exchange of correspondence between different practitioners debating analytic methodologies, debating tradecraft, debating collection issues. And again, befitting the technology of the days, his view was somewhat of a classified republic of letters. The idea that, there would be an early professional journal and that there would be some sort of conversation over the pace and time he was used to. Well, this isn't the industrial age. This isn't, the 1950s. And this conversation is happening in near real time across Twitter, across our information sharing groups. And it's a very different sort of thing when it becomes as informal as it's been. And we're missing a lot of the ways in which we've captured that and communicating that. Even though this new exchange has brought in a tremendous number of practitioners, we've brought a lot of folks up to speed very quickly around key debates. And we've got folks contributing to those debates at earlier stages in their career than any prior generation, which are all incredibly encouraging. Things like this event likewise are encouraging. I mean, this just would not have been possible in any earlier era. But at the end of the day, we need to do better because we continue to still talk past each other. Again, we talk about commercial cyber intelligence. in government language as the privatization of intelligence in a new domain. Privatization of intelligence remains an incredibly controversial context. One of my colleagues about 20 years ago wrote that this was a subversion of government monopoly. At the time we were debating this idea of the revolution of intelligence affairs, the idea of what it means to have near real-time access to sensors, what it means to conduct intelligence in this new globalized environment. All of this is sort of passé for those of us that have been doing it for as long, but it's important to know why the initial framing fits the way it fits. And at the end of the day, my argument is that the idea of the government monopoly on intelligence is actually an odd ahistorical period in which we forgot what we knew about how the community came to be. We forgot about who the players really were. And we created this idea of a government monopoly around a couple big three-letter agency logos, when in reality, the world was much more complex. Now we're forced to confront that complexity, particularly as effectively government has abdicated in many ways its responsibility to protect the entities under its jurisdictions across many countries across the globe. We have companies that are directly facing hostile military, hostile intelligence service action on a daily basis, to say nothing of transnational criminal organizations. And these entities have to prioritize work. They have to allocate scarce resources against an overwhelming threat pressure in many cases. And at the end of the day, the best way to address allocation of scarce resources is to make that intelligence-led, intelligence prioritized based on adversary capabilities and intentions. For those of you that may or may not be familiar, there's a longstanding intelligence concept we call Kahn's law, after the scholar of cryptography in Bletchley Park, David Kahn. So he talks about what are the drivers of intelligence. Intelligence tends to be less prioritized on the offense in the prior way of thinking, based on the World War II experience. We can caveat that heavily when we talk about modern operations, but in the German experience, intelligence was less favored because you could simply charge over the next hill, see what was on the other side, and advance through contact, conduct reconnaissance by fire, understand simply by speed, shock, violence of action. Well, if you're defending, their intelligence is prioritized because you have an insufficient amount of resources defending against every attack, against every possible vector. You have to choose, you have to prioritize, you have to make those hard trade-offs. So again, Kahn's law applies equally in the boardroom as it does on the battlefield. We've seen this evolution of the space, and we've seen a dramatic increase in, frankly, the amount of resources in this space, the amount of money being spent, the amount of talent going into this environment. While it's hard to compare to traditional intelligence community budgets, because most of them are classified, a lot of countries are very much not forthcoming. A global estimate a few years back at one of the intelligence universities was estimating something like $100 billion spending across the major services in question. If you look at what intelligence contributions are, what the defensive cyber operations, cybersecurity market is, we're rapidly hitting that mark very within our own expenditures. And this leads to a pretty diverse marketplace, right? We've got a lot of different firms, a lot of different players. They bring in talent from different sources. And this is the source of this dispute. Some folks bring in organizational structures that are copied from the environments they knew before. It actually tends to be the most common way that things are set up, but that's not always the most appropriate, particularly where individuals that are setting up these shops have only had one predominant organizational experience. It gets a little bit better when you've had folks that have gone through a few and you can make some choices. You can begin to see some of those functional alignments. But in an atheoretic way, if you're building an organization that is not fit for the purpose of your current mission and merely inherited from something you knew before, there's some challenges. Having said that, there's only so many ways you can twist the levers and structure the functions and fight through the problem. So, we have some experience with this, and we have some folks that understand this in different ways. End of the day, a lot of this is a learning by doing thing. We're building the plane while we're flying it, all the usual analogies, right? It's a startup culture. You do what works until you need something better, and then you throw some band-aids on it, you backfill some tech debt, you backfill some organizational maturity. And I will note, this is one of those sources of collision in these communities. We've got a lot of folks that come into this business that come out of that scientific, technical engineering discipline, the hacker backgrounds. But we've got a lot of folks that are coming in as national security professionals, as intelligence professionals previously. And Sherman Kent often talks about the two different mindsets in intelligence. The folks that are the poets, that prefer descriptive language, communicate as human, versus mathematicians which prefer to communicate in hard percentages or code. Now, he was referring to this in the context of words of estimated probability. That is, how do you describe uncertainty around an unknown future? But at the end of the day, it's not just estimated language. This boils down to a collision that comes up in almost every bit of work practice in the environment. There are folks that like coded, scripted, structured interactions around intelligence processes. And there are folks that have very different mindsets. And you run into these process problems in a variety of these contexts in ways that you're not expecting. Without realizing it, you can get crossways even within your own shop, and particularly as you talk across shops around some of these major disputes. This is complicated by this, the idea that there is a limited formal maturity model for a variety of these activities. About 10 years ago, we attempted through one of the financial intelligence communities to put together a basis for a maturity model to evaluate different organizations under this. The Office Director of National Intelligence sponsored something at Carnegie Mellon that was finalized in 2019 after a number of years of effort that did a much better job than we had done 10 years ago, and frankly, a much less mature commercial environment. But at the end of the day, that's not been heavily adopted. And frankly, when we do have those types of consultative evaluations within a shop, and consultants or neutral third-party assessors look at processes, look at organizations, we often see that these ratings become very much disputed. And we do see some bureaucratic organizational jockeying to talk through that maturity, to represent one's shop and one's process activity as more mature than it really is. That always becomes a bit of a challenge, right? But we know how organizations fail. We know how organizations fit together. One of the other challenges we have here is our prior literature of intelligence, our prior views of intelligence tradecraft really grew out of this idea that intelligence activities were the president's own, at least in the US parlance, the Queen's own in the British parlance. They were meant to serve a unitary executive. They were meant to solve a set of problems at the highest echelons of the organization, and everything else was, therefore, some sort of secondary tier within that structure. That's not necessarily the way that this works for organizations in the commercial sector. And particularly, it's not the way that it works for organizations that must support multiple different clients, whether it's different business units within one firm or a vendor that's supporting hundreds, if not thousands, of different client entities that have chose to work in a managed construct for these activities. So a lot of our mission management, a lot of our requirements management structures come down to some old techniques that require adaptation in different views. The best one of these, or let me rephrase this, the most widely recognized and adopted version of these come from a 1970s era practice within the national intelligence community that we called key intelligence questions. It's so widely adopted in the commercial environment because it is something that that came in the competitive intelligence space from a former scientific and technical national intelligence officer by the name of Jan Herring, a good friend, and was adopted in a variety of other contexts, from law enforcement intelligence, from a variety of other missions, under this idea of key intelligence topics. We've, however, seen a lot of other variations on national tradecraft adopted by folks who were not aware of that thread of the community's tradecraft. A lot of folks take old military and field manuals, and they see that there are things like commander's priority intelligence requirements or commander's critical intelligence requirements, and they will attempt to build their intelligence mission management structures around these ideas, which work, but they're generally intended for a more tactical level of development. They're intended as a process functional, but they miss some of the complexity that we've built in national tradecraft in other contexts. Of course, there's the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, and the associated Department of Homeland Security track requirements for frameworks. Many of these documents are not publicly available. Versions of things purporting to be these documents, which I won't comment either way, have come out through various document leak sources, including the actions of the defector, Edward Snowden. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily help one looking at a purported document of that nature to understand the context in which that document was produced, to understand the processes by which the things within those documents are managed, and frankly, how a priorities framework is adjudicated between different competing and often irreconcilable views of priorities between different stakeholders. We also miss some of the consultative tradecraft here, particularly when it comes down to that consumer needs negotiation. A lot of intelligence consumers don't actually know what they want. They think they do in some cases. They will ask good questions, but it often requires a lot of work to draw out those questions to get down to what they're really concerned about. Particularly where we have formal requirements management processes within different intelligence organizations that then pass those requirements in different ways out to intelligence vendors or to folks supporting them in the community. There's a bit of gamesmanship there. Organizations don't always want to reveal where they're weak or reveal where their areas are of greatest concern in either contested competitive environments, in environments where there is some degree of mistrust around potential adversary penetration, or simply a degree of embarrassment. So there's a lot of complexity into this that it gets missed in our discussion of this tradecraft. We also have some challenges when folks mistake production requirements for collection requirements, or engagement requirements for a production requirement or a collection requirement. And at the end of the day, we have some organizations that actually have formal collection management positions, which are nothing more than managing requests to vendors for specific production activities, or requests to liaison partners for information sharing. These are very different types of requirements management processes. And we don't really explore that tradecraft as well within our communities as we ought. And as a result, we wind up talking past each other around some of the key disputes. There's also a major impact from the speed at which our targets change and the operational tempo which we have to drive the intelligence activities as well as the consumer needs fulfillment processes. It's simply not like national community where we have 30, 40, 50 years of experience on different classes of targets. Now, again, in a time of pandemic, we can talk about how much things change and how quickly the world may change. But at the end of the day, I'll call back to the futures intelligence process that drove an activity known as Proteus. Back at the turn of the millennium, we were looking at future intelligence collection challenges, future challenges of intelligence activities in the year 2020. And one of the scenarios we looked at was Amazon.Plague. The idea that we would face a world swept by serial pandemics, that social distancing would be a mandatory function, that transportation of physical persons would be deprioritized, and that virtual techniques would become the key method of interaction. And of course, CrisisCon gives proof to this as being its own view. Not happy with living in that world, but here we are. At the end of the day, all of this consultative tradecraft abstracts some of the national processes set in place at the NSC level or the heads of agency level, but we've delegated this in the commercial community down to our first line client managers, down to individual branch managers, down to individual line analysts working day to day that must negotiate these issues, oftentimes with very little or no support. And we're not teaching this, we're not talking about this, we're kind of throwing folks in to sink or swim. And when we run into disputes, we're not documenting that, we're not looking through this. We also tend to inappropriately emphasize specific axes of intelligence value. Now there's about 20 or 30 features of intelligence value, depending on which source, which value you want to talk about. But at the end of the day, we really talk about this idea of actionability in commercial cyber intelligence, right? It's a watchword, it's almost a fetish. It is an important dynamic. It's one of the axes of value. It happens to be weighted rather heavily in most conversations. But, and we do to some extent acknowledge that intelligence must be relevant to the consumer, it must be timely, there is a latest time of information of value. but we don't necessarily emphasize some of the other features of intelligence value that have as much or more impact on our consumers' perceptions. And as a result of this, we really lose the ability to have a coherent conversation when we're disputing types of intelligence, the quality of intelligence, and talking about the levels of rigor we want to see in these conversations. We also do a terrible job of talking about collection, especially within our own communities. Now, there are unique aspects of collection that are held closely within different organizations based on the sources and methods unique to that organization. At this end of the day, though, there is a concept of a wider collection discipline that's missing. So in the geospatial intelligence community, in the imagery intelligence community, you may keep close hold the specific ground resolution or spectral bands that a given satellite may see. You may have questions about hearability that you simply don't disclose. But at the end of the day, there's a general acknowledgement that there is a set of tradecraft around taking an image, understanding what's in that image, regardless of where it's sourced from, and doing things like measuring how large objects are in that image. Right? We have a series of organized processes that are recognized as functions within that collection discipline. We don't have cyber as a collection discipline. I absolutely detest the attempts to introduce cyberint or scient as a collection discipline, much as we see for OSINT or geoint or imint or humint, for example. And these are undefined, they're unusably vague, and at the end of the day, we have a basket of capabilities that have different predecessor tradecraft from different types of disciplines that make collecting these things together under one rubric actually more damaging than if we understood them uniquely within their own means. So I'll simply call out a few of the examples I list here. We're all very familiar with exploitation of malware artifacts. We understand that we have a sample, we need to conduct static and dynamic analysis, we need to reverse engineer the sample, understand what it does, understand how it came to be, understand what tool marks or other code similarities may exist in this sample. The closest analogy to that tradecraft exists in other scientific and technical intelligence disciplines, but it's a form of foreign material exploitation. Traditionally, it's the kind of thing that happens when we recover a warhead that's crashed in the middle of the desert, for example, as we've seen in recent public disclosures from other conflicts. I won't belabor that example. However, when we start talking dynamic analysis within that malware artifact exploitation, we're running it to see its behavior on a system, but we're also looking at its network traffic with its command and control server. We may be trying to understand, particularly if that traffic is insecure, understand what those communications look like. That becomes in tradecraft very similar to what we look at under foreign instrumentation signals intelligence. It's a very specific subdiscipline, generally looking at things like hostile missiles that are communicating back in real time to a command and control environment of their own. We've got a variety of other different examples we can draw out of the unclassified national literature there. I won't dive too much into each one of these examples, just in the interest of time, but there is a different tradecraft for each of these environments. A lot of this tradecraft has been built uniquely within the commercial cyber intelligence community of practice, within the security research community of practice, but there are predecessor functions. There are tradecraft concepts that have a tremendous applicability that tie into this environment in a very different way. And we'll also note that not all organizations conduct all of these types of activities. Not all organizations understand these activities as they're conducting them as a professional, disciplined function. And frankly, there's a wide variance in the degree of risk that different organizations are willing to tolerate in the conduct of these activities. And frankly, there's a lot of different organizations that don't want to make the kinds of investment to both conduct these activities in a professional manner and manage the risk of these activities. So we often wind up having a set of disputes that emerge as folks are arguing that certain types of activities are not necessary or even unhelpful in order to justify that lack of organizational appetite to themselves, to their prospective clients, to their prospective stakeholders. And at the end of the day, that really distorts some of this discussion. We'll also note that even when organizations may start out wishing or may grow into an appetite for certain risk, that is a particularly fragile type of life cycle. Organizations change over time as there are different parts of their institutional history, and as different leadership and management structures come and go. So folks that may have had an appetite at one point may no longer. Other folks may recognize that they don't have a choice but to accept greater degrees of risk, tolerate different types of activities, or make larger investments than they previously had. We also have a pretty dramatic inconsistency in the talent base that is then brought into those organizations over time. So we talk a bit about the concepts of knowledge, skills, and abilities, where different folks will have a background, will have a set of professional practice experiences that corporate organizations tend to be very poor at recognizing. Now, in the national community, we have Intelligence Community Directive 610, where we map these out across multiple competence areas. These don't tend to fit well in the nice, soft, and fluffy corporate HR world, even where they are mapped and even when they've been folks have tried to bring them in. It's a difficult challenge. We also have, frankly, a degree of all the areas of intelligence tradecraft, we have a greater degree to which these areas of collection tradecraft has been understudied. For a period of time, it was actually argued you could not study collection activities outside of the classified domain. There's some historical baggage, there's subject matter expertise needs. This impacts our training pipeline. This impacts the degree of familiarity different intelligence professionals have in managing these activities, and frankly, how well they're even understood among analytic cadres. It becomes a challenge over time. Beyond analysis, we do run into some issues where beyond collection, we run into some issues with variation of analysis. This atheoretic development of activity results in divergence of product and divergence of analytic application that's often greatly divorced from the body of tradecraft that we understand and have documented a little bit better in other communities. I won't get too much into this long-standing fight about what is true cyber threat intelligence, right? I think there is a general consensus that cyber threat activities, sorry, am I missing questions?
Oh, no, you're good, JD. I'm just putting observations in as you're going along. Please continue.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't skipping you, right? Long story short, the consensus is that mere IOCs, mere structuring of indicators of compromise feeds, however processed, however ordered, is itself not the sum total of cyber threat intelligence. We do, however, still tend to focus heavily on the technical and descriptive reporting. Right? We have a tradition that says hashes or it didn't happen, logs or it didn't happen. There is a lot of value to this in an era of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, that's clouding up conversations in an era of very bad computer and cybersecurity journalism. There's reasons to push back and focus on these things. But at the end of the day, that's not the be-all and end-all of what we do. We have extensive work around clustering campaigns, tracking intrusion sets based on technical visibility over time. We have a profound Rosetta mapping problem, which some folks talk only as a naming problem, but at the end of the day is actually a little bit more complex. We do have some non-technical reporting, including dissemination of raw collection in some cases. And that's a weird thing. In the national community, we've known since World War II that disseminating raw collection to consumers that are not prepared and steeped in that collection discipline is actually often counterproductive to the purpose. Dissemination of raw collection to analysts without an intermediate reports layer of an organization can be equally counterproductive. We've built very complex national community processes to manage these outcomes. Now we can argue about whether those processes are or are not appropriate in the organizational context of a specific commercial intelligence activity. But to ignore that debate has happened, to not understand the reasons why that debate came to be, is very painful. And at the end of the day, sorry, I keep saying that far too often. We also see dramatic arguments over Attribution analysis is purpose function. We argue about the role of strategic analysis. We have lost, in many cases, our anticipatory functions. We've lost some of our counterintelligence purposes for this intelligence tradecraft. To say nothing of some of the weird experimental things we're playing with in other national communities, like fiction intelligence, ficint. Now we can debate what ficint is, whether it's really an int, whether it's just simply an analytic methodology applied with a narrative construct. That can be a whole separate talk. I'm happy to have that, or bring in our friend August Cole to do that. We do have a couple of generic models, though, that folks have come to embrace. We have the kill chain, we have the diamond model, we have miter attack. But that's not quite the same as formal target modeling for each environment that in each adversary that we're looking at. We hand out the target-centric intelligence text from our colleague Clark as almost the introductory text to a variety of our environments. I've been handing out copies of that now for 20 years to different folks. But I see perhaps once or twice a year a formal target model circulated between analysts or in sharing groups. You know, that's a challenge. We know how to do this differently. And of course, periodically we do rediscover this idea of structured analytic techniques, right? Folks will come back to our friend Dick Hoyer, and they will read the excellent work that he did. We still miss him every day. And we find a lot of folks, because of the accessibility, because of the free nature of that text, we'll start there, and as is appropriate, right? To talk about cognitive defects, to talk about the ways in which our minds fail us as we struggle to grapple with non-human scale intelligence problems is very important. But unusually enough, we're seeing some pushback from extant practitioners who deride structured analytic techniques, who display a lack of interest. And again, they're not solely a single outcome for any given problem. It's not one hammer fits all nails. It's a kit bag of tools. You reach in, you grab the right tool for the right application. And unfortunately, I think a lot of this derision comes from not understanding the fit between the tool and the application, because Dick didn't really talk much about that, right? And a lot of the folks that are interpreting his text within our communities of practice themselves don't necessarily have the experience across the range of types of problems in the application of structured analytic techniques to tackle these things. They also don't necessarily see the failure modes, or have not necessarily seen the failure modes in operational practice, to then introduce some of the correctives we know in applying structured analytic techniques. This has been a challenge. We have seen some fitful attempts to engage. I was incredibly pleased to see Carmen Medina talk a little while back at the San CTI Summit. Carmen, for those of you that don't know, ran the Kent School for Analysis before going on to a very senior role at Central Intelligence Agency. A lovely lady who has forgotten more about tradecraft than most of us have ever known. I'm really glad to see her in that discussion. There's some other folks in that conversation that we'd like to bring in. And we'd like to fix some of that conversation where through that engagement, we will stop talking past each other around these top techniques. I'll call out particularly an area where we are desperately talking past each other has been in the failure of warning tradecraft. We know from long-standing case studies and histories that anticipatory intelligence in all of its forms tends to be overwhelmed by the demands of current intelligence. Often, current intelligence firefighting destroys strategic work, it destroys anything other than the day-to-day fight. However, we still have this dominance of an annual predictions product that comes out from a lot of shops and from a lot of different organizations, even internally. This is in some ways a marketing product, in some ways it's something gives the executive something to read over the Christmas or New Year's break, depending, something in conjunction with RSA, if RSA is early enough in a year. It has a lot of value for different functions. But if we're doing this without proper futures intelligence tradecraft, we're doing our customers a disservice. There might be individual insight, there might be individual brilliance that we manage to capture, but we're missing some things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But abandoning traditional indications and warning functions, and in this I do not mean indicators of compromise, which unfortunately has abused some of the INW language itself, but abandoning traditional INW functions does lead to inevitable surprises. There is a complex body of warning tradecraft. It is a dedicated and purpose-built function. In the national community, we've just established a lot of our NW in favor of the idea that every analyst can produce warning. That has its role, and there's different debates around these theories, but it didn't mean we threw away warning entirely. And unfortunately, I've seen very few true warning products issued in the commercial intelligence domain. And where we do see warnings, it's usually the naive prediction. That is, well, we've seen this thing before, we predict more of the same, be warned. That's not quite the same as a true warning product. For me, this really came home, hit hard in 2017, where we saw multiple opportunities to provide warning in advance of significant globally destructive adversary action. And that warning was simply not issued in just about any context that mattered. I was personally part of this in a number of contexts. I bear personal responsibility as much as anything else. So I'm not sitting here pointing fingers at other folks. I am reaching out my arms to say we must collectively as a community do better, because we have this hard year as our example. It wasn't the last, and it won't be the last for many years to come. We also have to come to terms with this variation of production and dissemination, right? We have different dissemination models based on different technologies, and these are changing the producer-consumer relationships in ways we don't fully understand. The longstanding dispute within the national community was, where do we position the analyst, right? Are they at a distance from the consumer? Are they in some sort of unique, locked down intellectual environment to be objective, to be separated from the different pressures which can change analytic judgment if they're too close to their consumer, to their decision maker? Or are they better at the elbow? Are they better in an advisory role? We have different models and different types of intelligence tasks where we've debated this for some time. We're not even really having that debate anymore in the commercial intelligence domain. We're simply throwing it all against the wall as different organizations build. We have embedded analysts, we have staff-like roles, we have remote roles. We've got a variety of different types of problems. And we're not thinking through some of the pressures on those analysts, working with them to help them understand how that's impacting their work, and dealing with it on the organizational and tradecraft levels across the community to help reduce the pressure from some of the things like clientism or some of the attempts to politicize different types of products in support of different favored outcomes for decision makers, versus keeping them too isolated where they don't understand the context and roles of those consumers. And at the end of the day, we've got this really weird thing in Slack. We are now dropping analysts and collectors live into informal liaison relationships with their consumers, with different professionals and practitioners across the community. And we're tearing down some things that used to be pretty tightly siloed in different tradecraft communities. We can't pretend that's not happening. We can't ignore the fact that it exists. It's profoundly disruptive, and there's been almost no discussion. There's been no case studies. There's been no examination, and it matters. I'll leave that be for the moment. We've seen a devolution in coordination tradecraft concurrent to all of this. Coordination is a formal process in the national community, both within an analytic shop to improve outcomes, to make sure it's truly a corporate product, but it's also across different functional roles between collectors and analysts, between different entities with different organizational stakeholder equities. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of times where it's not adopted in the commercial environment in a lot of shops. Where it has been adopted in different shops, we've seen bastardization as mere peer review. And this isn't peer review. This isn't an academic process, right? It shares some similarities, but it is a different functional role. I won't dive into all the equities that get overlooked, but we're not having that conversation the way we ought. We can do better on that conversation. We also increasingly lack the ability to resolve divergent views and analytic disputes, even within individual shops, and particularly across shops and across the community. There's a fragility to analytic collaborative behavior these days. Now, part of it is diagnosed to the classic pathology of intelligence of inappropriate ego investment. If you define yourself as an analyst or a security researcher by what you know, you tend to be a lot more brittle in your views when someone challenges the basis of how you think you know these things, or the basis of how you understand an adversary. If you, however, define yourself as an intelligence professional, as someone who can generate insight into hard targets, denied areas, uncertain adversaries based on conflicting, incomplete, or deliberately deceptive information, you wind up seeing yourself in a very different light. So it's not about this knowledge that you've built up over years of your career. It's about how you do against your next target. And this is an incredibly important dynamic that we're missing a lot because of how our communities have been built across different groups of practitioners. We also have this rock star dynamic, right? You give a talk at a con, you get associated with a given product, a given line of research. For a lot of folks in the commercial industry, that's a significant bump to your next paycheck, right? It's the way you get your next job. It's how you stay mobile in an increasingly difficult industry, right? That, of course, though, starts breaking down some of the context in which we have previously advised intelligence folks to only publish in collective and corporate fashion, that your work will be known amongst your peers, even if your byline is not on a given piece of work. Well, increasingly, our community is so large that is hard to assure. And we're trying to balance these things in new ways we haven't had to balance elsewhere in the national community. It's a challenge. We also have a bit of a generational dynamic. I won't harp too much on this, but our education system is different over different cohorts coming into our workforce. The way in which we resolve disputes, or the way in which we have competitive projects, or the way in which we've had, frankly, experiences of simply fighting amongst our peer groups are different from generation to generation. And unfortunately in the workforce, it's a pretty hard thing to learn for the first time, the ability to take that kind of criticism, to have that kind of thick skin. And that, I've seen that across every age cohort. So, you know, we have understudied this problem at the moment. We will look at the impact of divergence across our community in different ways, right? Where professionals do not do the work still gets done, even if it's not professional. We have a lot of different norms and conflict as these communities collide, right? We've got Silicon Valley level advocacy beliefs that set forth the idea that we should live our ideals, that we have a moralistic or we have an ideological stance, and that our work should reflect this. Well, that's not necessarily the national community stance. That's a traditional tradecraft. As an individual, you step back from the problem. You are not personalized in this problem in any way, and you try to be as objective and as neutral as possible. We don't do a great job of sorting out these areas of dispute in the current environment. We also run into a lot of tradecraft risk where non-intelligence professionals are doing intelligence or intelligence-like activities without looking at those standards of tradecraft. So we have issues of privacy, we have issues of speech, we have some other fundamental rights over the years, but we also have some fundamental tradecraft risk that comes in. I will add a couple propositions of tradecraft risk here very quickly. First of all, commercial and secondary personal purposes may influence intelligence product in ways that the traditional literature, traditional tradecraft has not considered. Now, there is a belief in a lot of government intelligence circles that any commercial purpose is therefore presumptively illegitimate. I do not believe this. There are legitimate commercial purposes. There are legitimate pressures and considerations in impacting intelligence activities in the private sector, but we do have new risks of distortion of an intelligence outcome that we have to work through. There is a model by which we can evaluate tradecraft risk in existing processes and outputs, and we can evaluate for correctives, but we have to look at that within the context of the work itself, and we have to look at it with that jaundiced professional eye, skeptical of everything, looking for those pathologies, because pathologies creep into everything we do, regardless of the community we came from. We have imperfect minds, we're struggling with difficult issues under time pressures, under emotional pressures, under organizational pressures. We will make mistakes. The body of tradecraft practice exists to guard against those mistakes. Greater risk attaches to intelligence where it's used outside of its originally intended decision support context. When you take an originally published analytic product and then you try to present it in public context or use it for marketing, risk accumulates, risk can accrue in unusual ways. Secondary audiences that may not necessarily be sensitized to the context of original production bring with them different risks. And ultimately, marketing itself, blunt marketing, is the greatest area of risk, where intel-like artifacts are created by non-intelligence professionals outside of the analytic shop. In theory, we have a marketplace that can correct for these problems. That, you know, if a shop routinely puts out marketing not grounded in true intelligence, they tend to rightly face some consequences from prospective buyers, and that modifies their behavior. That's a slow process. That creates, however, cascading problems across the community. It's a type of intelligence failure. Very briefly, I throw out this incentive framework to look at the areas of greater risk. So red here is the area of greatest risk. Amber is areas we need to be a little bit concerned about. Light green are areas where errors can creep in. Green are areas where we have existing tradecraft practices that apply a little bit more coherently. So we have different types of work between finished intelligence products, intermediate intelligence products. That is things that were built around a descriptive or explanatory purpose around one artifact or one tool set or one campaign, for example. We have individual research or analyst communications with members of the community of practice, with their consumers in ways that are not necessarily structured. And of course, we have the delivery of raw or even annotated collection outputs to different contexts, which can be challenging, right? We've recognized this for years. This can occur in the context of trusting working groups, can occur within consultative delivery models, within private subscriptions, or within different types of open publishing. And of course, there's the riskiest activity where folks are just marketing directly to the media, or for individual researchers where they're trying to build their personal brand. Now, that's not necessarily an illegitimate activity in either case. Organizations must have customers to continue doing their work internally as an organic function or as a vendor. And if you're a researcher, you need to be part of your community, and it's something we understand. But to understand the ways in which that impacts tradecraft risk is pretty important. I won't get into this too much, but CTI, cyber threat intelligence, is not merely support for cybersecurity or defensive cyber operations, right? There is work being done supporting counter cyber operations missions, supporting offensive cyber operations, as well as cyber policymaking, cyber legislation. These communities are all evolving in parallel. They're building their own types of professionals, and in some cases, we're seeing divergence there. I won't dive into that too much, but the one I usually use to call out is why we have these silly cyber bombs, right? There was a period of time in the national community where very senior officials would say things like, we're dropping cyber bombs on different targets. That was not considered beyond the pale. Obviously, we have different opinions across different communities about what that sounds like and how we interpret those artifacts. We're running into issues even talking on a common basis of language or imagery because of these challenges. And, you know, not always the most helpful, right? I'll wrap up on the question of how we address this, right? Divergence is fundamentally a property of the failure of intelligence studies to adapt to this changing mission realities, right? It's nice, it's fun to write about Cold War era tunnel operations or defectors, right? There's a lot of value to be drawn from this, but connecting that to the current missions we faced, connecting that to the current problem spaces we're in, is a challenge. The literature of intelligence has been silent on many of these issues, right? What's being written is not being written by the practitioners in many cases, or folks that were former practitioners. And when we do reach the topic, it tends to be a little bit stale, right? It's well-trod ground that's been covered so frequently as to be irrelevant. You know, the attribution problem, to my view, is no longer an interesting debate about whether it can be done. The question is how it's done, how well it's done, the context and sources of error, the meaning it's drawn for different consumer outcomes, you know, all of the dozens of secondary questions. It has only been in the past several years that we've recognized that in the academic and scholarly communities. Practitioners have known this for a very long time, and I think I'm preaching to the choir with this audience. There's also some structural, organizational, institutional issues that we have to overcome. You know, we have expertise and compensation issues, we have relationships with peer review, gatekeeping problems, right? And frankly, we're not well connected to the wider field of cyber conflict or international relations, international security studies. There's a lot of very interesting, very important thinking that's gone into geopolitical analysis, gone into international relations context and other views that we see very rarely adopted or incorporated in the practitioner's world for intelligence. Now, we've known this as a national problem in other disciplines for a very long time, but it's particularly starting to bite us in the cyber intelligence world. And we have to struggle with this. So if I can end only on the one idea, it's that the cultivation of the analyst, the cultivation of the collector is an individual responsibility for every practitioner. If you're doing this work, you must grow yourself, you must grow those around you. particularly when you step into the senior practitioner role, into the senior individual contributor role, into work as a branch manager or leading a shop. You start that cultivation by reading widely, reading across a variety of contexts and disciplines. You contribute to that literature, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's in your sharing group, preferably whether it's in a formal journal or some other more enduring environment. Here, I'll put a plug. I am on the editorial advisory board for the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. Always interested in seeing your pieces. Not everyone wants to publish in an academic venue, though. There are a variety of non-traditional venues, whether it's War on the Rocks or Wavell Room or Lawfare or a variety of these other places where we're working through this. Now, it's not always the easiest process, right? We've all got blogs, though. We've all got different ways we can put this out there. I'll also say, when you're working in a shop, look at these roles for formal methodologists. Methodology is incredibly important, and the number of times having a fresh set of perspectives brought in to do something we've not done or an enduring problem will yield new types of answers, or better yet, new types of questions that we can then drive collection and analytic activity around. It helps us solve things a little bit differently. I will note it is incredibly important in this BuzzFeedy, clickbaity, headline-driven era, Twitter rage factory era, to drop politics when we're working on these intelligence questions, right? Focus on tradecraft. We spend a lot of time ranting about these things in different communities. The more we repeat that well-trod ground, the more we reinforce our anchoring biases, the more we reinforce through confirmation bias, other cognitive defects, it begins to creep into our work in other ways. It's a professional standard. It may not be a Silicon Valley standard, but it definitely matters. And of course, I'll just end. This art is something that will endure beyond our lifespans. We are not given enough days to become the master of all aspects of this. It is an art, however, that rewards us dramatically as we drive on to the performance of this craft over years. And it will live long beyond our own days if we can contribute to this wider community. With that, I'm happy to take questions, continue discussions.
I think we're bumping up a little bit on time, but that was fascinating. And there's been some good discussion going on in chat. So JD, thanks a lot for that. That was really good, really interesting, especially for the threat intelligence mafia that's logged on this morning. Yeah, so that was great. There's been some discussion items. I don't know if you can see the question and answer console, JD. Unfortunately, it's not working for me. If anyone has we have one question in chat. Why not should GovMil and private sector intelligence communities move towards shared lexicons, tradecraft, structures, purposes, etc.? I guess if I could summarize that one, is it beneficial to have separate standards or separate ways of operating between these communities instead of looking at an ideal as the two converging?
So there's a lot of benefits to at least a shared common understanding, even if we're not willing to adopt each other's lexicons. There's a point in time when we have to be able to at least not talk past each other. It's not always easy. The government is very happy to live in this little classified bubble and not talk about things. The private sector is happy to build our cliques of cool kids that, keep everyone else out and, bring in only the folks who are willing to come drink with us and meet us only on our terms. There's tensions on both sides. There are different purposes. Understanding those purposes, be able to articulate that, and creating a language which makes those distinctions clear is pretty important. And even where we can't agree, we can at least maybe agree to disagree and lay out the basis for that dispute, right?
Okay, no, excellent. That's a hours-long discussion even on its own, but maybe something for a future discussion. So with that, unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut JD off at this point, so we have enough time for Matthias, who is going to be up next to talk about honeypots, which is always a fun discussion. So again, thanks a lot, JD. That was really good. I hope everyone enjoyed that. And with that,